only thing I will say is that before we
In a television studio in Western Australia, a 53-year-old former Londoner, Desmond Cusson, has agreed to watch a film on the Ruth Ellis murder case. He knows more about Ruth Ellis than most, for in 1955 he was one of two men in her life. Ruth Ellis shot and killed her other lover outside a London pub. It was a crime for which she hanged 22 years ago.
OK.
On June the 21st, Ruth Ellis was found guilty of murder at the Old Bailey and sentenced to death in accordance with the law. On July the 13th, she was executed in accordance with the law. But Britain's conscience was uneasy. During those 3 weeks, while public controversy mounted, one man had a terrible decision to make, Home Secretary William Lloyd George. As he went about his public duties, he had to decide whether or not to write the grim words, "The law must take its course."
The press said she wept and cried when she was going to the scaffold. And she said something to me just before she died. That was in the press. She never spoke to me.
She came to you?
She came to me as though she was just walking the ordinary way, walked right to me, the trapdoor where the person has to stand, like a T-mark, and her feet stand in the T-mark, you see. And she never spoke to me. I can see her now, just flicked her eyes and she just puckered her lips so she was trying to smile, you know. She's a brave woman.
Ruth Ellis was the last woman to hang in Britain. Cartoonist Jack Dunkley was a juror at her trial.
She'd gone out, waited for this man to come out, shot him 4 or 5 times, I think. It was just premeditated murder. As plain as that. And there was no other verdict that we could bring in. The evidence proved that she was just a determined woman who knew what she was going to do. And it was I don't have to go into the case. It was the old Frankie and Johnny. He'd done her wrong, and that was it.
In this Hampstead pub on the evening of April 10th, 1955, Ruth Ellis's lover, David Blakely, had been drinking with a friend. An off-duty policeman was also in the bar.
I'd been out with friends over Hampstead Heath, having a stroll, and we looked at Hampstead Heath Fair, and we'd just come in here for a drink before going home, basically. And I noticed Blakely and Gunnell come into the saloon bar because I think everyone else in the pub did. They were in a fairly boisterous mood. I'd previously seen a woman peering through the window, and she'd been walking up and down outside, although somebody had, and I assumed that it was her.
And there was a young woman pacing up and down. Well, then, as we got to the corner, the young woman, 2 young men ran out of the pub with port bottles in their hands. And they, of course, were Clive Gunnell and David Blakely.
I never noticed the going of Gunnell and Blakely. And then all of a sudden I heard shots outside.
She took a shot. Well, now, I never knew where that bullet went. But Clive Gunnell ran back into the pub to give the alarm. And David Blakely, like a fool, ran round the car. And she ran after him and she put 2 bullets in his back. And he got round to the front of the bonnet of the car and he collapsed on the pavement. I shall never forget. He raised himself up on one elbow, and I shall never forget the look of appeal in his eyes. And she put 2 more bullets into him deliberately. I was petrified. I couldn't move on my corner. Well, then, she very slowly brought up the gun like that, but she couldn't do it. She went like that, and it went off, and the bullet hit the road and ricocheted clean through this hand of mine into the wall behind me.
I came outside and the first thing I saw was a man lying on the pavement just there. And he was bleeding. Blood was coming from his mouth. And woman, Ruth Ellis, who I now know, she was standing over him with a gun at kind of a right angles.
But pointing still at the body?
Pointing at his body. I took the gun off her and, well, I had a look at Blakely. I could see I could do nothing for him. It was obviously to me that he was dying.
When you saw Ruth Ellis fire that first shot,
Yes.
here you were out for an evening's drink in
With my
North London
husband.
Street with your husband. What thoughts went through your mind?
I said to my husband, I say, this is a party, seeing the boys running out with the bottles. I said, they've got one of those toy guns. But when Clive ran back in, and he ran round and she started, I knew I was wrong.
It was something more serious.
It was murder.
She was extremely calm and cool from the time she came into the dock until the end of the trial. I must admit, it rather surprised me. And I came to the conclusion that she was so certain that she was going to be convicted that she'd made up her mind, she'd got to face it.
How strongly did you get that impression? How quickly after you had seen her?
Well, of course, I saw her as she came into the dock. Then I saw her. I didn't look at her, I must say, hardly at all during the case of the prosecution. Then she came in the witness box, and of course I have to look at a witness in the witness box. You know, one of the things we have to do is try and make out the witness is telling the truth. And you have to observe their demeanour and that sort of thing. And of course, I was bound to look at her then. Matter of fact, she was telling the truth in most respects, I'm sure. Unfortunately, the truth for her was fatal.
For the first and only time in my life, I wrote down the question. I wanted to be perfectly cold and clear, and I wanted a cold and clear answer. I wanted the effect of a plea of guilty to the offence by an admission of the ingredients which made up the offence.
And what was that question?
The question, I repeat, when you fired that revolver at close range into the body of David Blakely, what did you intend to do?
And her answer?
Her answer was, it is obvious, I intended to kill him.
Of all the murder cases that you've been involved in, was the defence in the Ruth Ellis case perhaps one of the weaker ones?
Yes, it was so weak, I think you could say it was non-existent.
From the beginning, it had been Solicitor John Bickford's task to marshal that defence. Faced with an overwhelming case, did he have any hope at all of saving her life?
Yes, of course I had hope.
Based on what?
Nothing. Me.
Your ability as a lawyer?
Well, I believed so then. I made a mistake, didn't I?
You see, on the face of it, the phrase an open and shut case is virtually irresistible.
It looked like it, and that was why the police didn't bother too much to trace the story about the gun. Originally.
You believe that?
Yeah. I think they thought they had it in the bag and that was it.
After the shooting, Ruth Ellis was taken to Hampstead Police Station into the interview room near the rear entrance. Just before midnight, she was questioned about the murder of David Blakely. Her answer was short and to the point. She said, "I'm guilty." But it wasn't that simple. As the police went into the background to the shooting, they discovered that there wasn't one man in Ruth Ellis's life. There were two. She'd been arrested for the murder of David Blakely. But she'd also lived with Desmond Cusson, director of a firm of tobacconists whom she'd known for about 3 years and with whom she'd lived during the previous winter. The day after the murder, Easter Monday, Desmond Cusson came here to Hampstead Police Station. He made a statement, and in it he said that in all the months he'd lived with Ruth Ellis, he'd never seen a gun in her possession. He added that the last occasion on which he'd seen her was at 7:30 the previous evening, almost 2 hours before the actual shooting. Ruth Ellis was charged with murdering David Blakely. She replied, "Thanks." Both here and later at Holloway Prison, she seemed totally unconcerned about what was going to happen to her. But one thing she did seem concerned about, and that was getting a message to Desmond Cusson.
I realised it must be terribly significant because she was so insistent I should give it to him. She said that she had forgotten to tell him that she had got the gun from a fellow at the Little Club who handed it over for security for £5 or something like that. And she said that she'd told the police this and she wanted me to tell Cousins.
Which is exactly what Bickford did, and he says Cusson proceeded to tell him a surprising story.
He said, well, the truth is that I, in fact, gave her the gun, but the police don't know that. And on her own insistence, he cleaned the gun, oiled it, cleaned all the bullets, put them in the gun, and then they went in the car together with the gun, with the loaded gun, in search of Blakely at Penn. But they couldn't find him. And on the way back, she suddenly said to him, "How do I know I can fire this thing?" So she got him to stop the car by a wood at Gerrard's Cross, I think it was, and she got out and she walked in the wood and she fired a shot at a tree, which apparently she hit.
According to Bickford, Cusson then told him that after the target practice, he and Ellis had driven back to Hampstead. Cusson had dropped her at Tanser Road, not far from the pub where Blakely was shot. Bickford's next task was to verify Cusson's story. He says he immediately went back to Holloway Prison to find out what Ruth Ellis would have to say about it.
The thing that happened was that she immediately said, yes, but I don't want Cousins involved in any circumstances whatsoever.
And Bickford's problems were increasing. His client now insisted on pleading guilty. But she also wanted brought out in court the hostility of Blakely's friends towards her. They were really to blame for the trouble between her and Blakely, she said. Then, why not plead not guilty and bring the story out, said Bickford. And she agreed. As Bickford delved into her background, he discovered that in her search for security, she'd found only crisis and unhappiness. Ruth was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Hornby. He was a musician whose stage name, Nielsen, was eventually adopted by the whole family. Ruth Nielsen spent her youth in Rhyl, North Wales. She didn't get on with her father, and she grew into a restless teenager. Then she met a Canadian soldier who said he wanted to marry her. She believed him. At 16, she became pregnant.
They evacuated her away somewhere in Yorkshire while she had Andre. And then when she came back, I met her at Waterloo, and she came back and stayed with me for a while.
What was the baby like?
Lovely. He was lovely. He slept all the way from the nursing home to my home and never woke up once in the journey, she said. And I can see her now, a pathetic little figure standing there, holding this baby, and it was awful.
But before the baby was born, Ruth was deserted by her first lover. He left her and flew home to Canada, to the wife and children he already had. He sent her a farewell bunch of red roses. A teenage, unmarried mother, unhappy at home, her first love affair in ruins, Ruth looked for escape to the glamour and excitement of London. She became a photographer's model, and soon after her 19th birthday, a hostess at a Mayfair nightclub. The nightclub was owned by Maury Conley, one of Britain's biggest vice bosses. Ruth, the club hostess, became Maury Conley's mistress. As a club hostess, she earned £5 a week plus commission on every drink she sold. Her sister Muriel came to see her at the club. And as she says, the job description club hostess covers a multitude of activities.
I heard this rumbling on the ceiling. I said to her, "What is that?" She got hold of a stick or something and banged on the ceiling and said, And she'd be quiet, you dirty bastards. And put a radiogram on as loud as it could be. So I said, well, what were they doing, Ruth? And she said, well, if you don't know, she said, I'm not telling you. And I was married with 5 children, and I couldn't understand what it was she was looking at. So that's how much I knew of what life she was leading, really, or what was going on.
In 1950, at the age of 24, Ruth became pregnant again and had an abortion. But soon after, a second opportunity presented itself to escape into what she saw as respectability. She met a dentist at the club. He wanted to marry her. His name, George Ellis. They married in November 1950, but they fought so bitterly that the police were often called to intervene. Then Ruth became pregnant again, and there were more problems. George Ellis was an alcoholic. He went into hospital for treatment, and while he was in mental hospital in 1951, Ruth gave birth to their child, a baby girl they called Georgina. But their marriage was already as good as over. Ruth left George Ellis, and she drifted back into her old ways of earning a living in London's clubland. She became manageress of the little club in Knightsbridge. And when she was off duty, it was in the steering wheel club that she frequently met her acquaintances in the world of motor racing. Among them, David Blakely. Blakely was a fledgling racing driver. He liked to mingle with the stars of the sport, Sterling Moss and Mike Hawthorne, for instance. He'd built his own car with the help of friends, and he was good enough to race with works teams. He called his car the Emperor. Cliff Davis knew Blakely's taste both in cars and women. Blakely was said even to have had an affair with the wife of his mechanic, Carol Findlater. Davis often raced against Blakely and had once shared a car with him.
He was a typical product of a public school system, well-educated, sophisticated, very supercilious, but I like David. He didn't have, not in my opinion, he didn't have a lot of backbone. You know, I found that out when I took him on that Daily Express rally. And it went on for a long, long time. And you need a co-driver to give you a relief. But David just flaked out after 5 or 6 hours. That was it. He was just a sack of potatoes in the passenger seat.
Jackie Dyer worked for Ruth Ellis as a barmaid. And like Cliff Davis, she felt the social gap between Blakely and Ellis would disrupt the affair in the end.
She saw that they were going to get married. You see, that all, you know, that was it. The little club, when she left the little club, that was the end of it. She was going to learn French to sort of come up to his standards socially, and they were going to get married and everything was going to be all right. And then, bang it went.
Yeah, I could go along with that too. I would think that David put her in promised land. I knew her father. He wouldn't have sanctioned a marriage between them. I should think he certainly would have cut off the bread.
To Ellis, Blakely's family in the great house at Penn was the pinnacle of social life in Buckinghamshire. Blakely's father had left him £7,000. It didn't last.
He was literally poncing on Ruth.
What do you mean?
Quite a period. Well, taking money for drinks and petrol and taking money to live. Because there were times when David was absolutely broke.
In November 1954, Ruth Ellis lost her job. She'd met Desmond Cusson at the club, and now she wanted to move in with him. Despite her affair with Blakely, Cusson agreed that she and her son could stay at his flat. The quarrels between Ellis and Blakely got worse. More than once, Ellis was badly beaten. It was Cusson who took her to hospital. Still obsessed with each other, Blakely and Ellis moved into 44 Egerton Gardens. It was a final attempt to live together, and the triangle became even more confused because Desmond Cusson helped to pay the rent. A month before the murder, Ruth was pregnant again. She and Blakely celebrated. But she was jealous of his other women. They quarrelled. Blakely punched her, and she miscarried. As ever, it was Cusson who comforted her. And while he did so, Blakely sought comfort elsewhere. Faith Roberts was a regular girlfriend.
Well, he arrived very late one night and knocked on the door, and I didn't know who it was because I was in bed. And he said, "It's David," and I opened the door and he came in. And he was in a very nervous state. And we talked for a while. I can't remember what we talked about. Eventually we went to bed. And when he got undressed, there were some marks on his back, and I said, "What's happened to your back?" And he said, "They're knife marks." And I said, "Whatever do you mean?" And he'd been talking about Ruth. And he said, "Ruth did it." I said, "It's not possible, David." He said, "I'm terrified of her." And I said, "Well, leave her." I said, "If you're that terrified, all you've got to do is up and leave." He said, "I can't. You don't know her." And I said, "That's impossible, David. How can you be frightened of a woman?"
Do you think Ruth realised that he was two-timing her?
Well, she was a fool if she didn't. But I think that's one of the things she had to accept, like the social standing. What could she do about it?
Answer me, oh my love, just what sin have I been guilty of? Tell me how I came to lose my love.
Ruth Ellis was given a tape recorder for Christmas. On it, while she was with Desmond Cusson, she confided her love for Blakely.
Yesterday, I believe that love was here to stay. Tell me where I've gone astray.
And it was to Cusson that she also confided her bitterness at the way she felt Blakely and his motor racing friends, like the Findlaters, had treated her.
No, seriously, Desmond, all joking aside, I think I've been a fool. Did you live in with that drip for 18 months now? Can you imagine it?
Why are you looking haggard there?
Oh, shut up. Oh, the black eye. David gave me a black eye. Sitting in a car park on New Year's night in Penn, Buckinghamshire at the Crown Hotel. Who wants him anyway? Pennis bastard.
Well,
there are cheapskates and cheapskates.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I have met cheapest of skates, ain't you? Mm. He really is the lowest of the low. He's just a little skunk. Seriously, he's rotten to the core. Anybody can have him as far as I'm concerned. He dresses a drip. He has the nerve to call himself social life of Buckinghamshire. I wouldn't know. But that's social life. God help the man. I still believe we were meant for each other. I still believe. Well, poke some other.
Just going to sleep, darling.
Oh, shut up. I don't want to go to sleep yet.
You want more, do you?
Oh, yes, darling. More, much more, more. Lots more.
Well, that's definitely the highly sexed Ruth, taking time out with someone else, but she couldn't do anything else but talk about David. I feel that the terrible thing that those two people should have ever met. They were so violently passionate with each other that any thought of control just disappeared.
Was David Blakely violent to Ruth
he
Ellis?
knocked her about. There's no question about that. I met Ruth many times in the little before David arrived, and it would be quiet, and she'd be knocked around, have marks on her face.
When I was telephoned and I was told that she shot him, I always thought it would have been her, him killing her. Do you know what I mean? Because, I mean, when they had an argument once, he practically squeezed her neck like this and held her up. And I always thought it would have been more him killing her than her killing him.
Easter weekend 1955, the weekend of the murder. Ellis and Blakely had arranged to go motor racing again. They planned drinks at the Findlaters on Good Friday. But Blakely didn't turn up. Ruth waited and then went to the Findlaters' home in Tanser Road, Hampstead, and smashed in the windows of Blakely's car. The police were called. After the uproar, Cusson drove her back to his flat, while she blamed the Findlaters yet again for coming between her and Blakely. For 2 days, Ruth tried to phone Blakely, but inside Tanser Road, there was a party going on. Blakely didn't wish to speak to her, they said. Eventually, Findlater simply hung up when he recognised her voice. She was furious. At 9:30 that night, Blakely was dead. Ruth Ellis had handed the murder weapon to an off-duty policeman, but however simple the case appeared, the police routine continued. The gun was examined at the forensic laboratory, and its condition gave this story an ironic twist, for Blakely might never have been shot. And the result of the tests?
Was that the bullets recovered from the body had without doubt been fired in that revolver.
Did the tests go smoothly?
Yes, the comparison tests went smoothly, but subsequently there was some difficulty with the mechanical functioning of the weapon.
What do you mean?
Well, during the test firing in the laboratory, the bolt in the bottom of the frame that locks the cylinder in position when a shot is fired broke.
And what effect would that have had on the gun, had it happened, say, 5, 6 shots earlier?
This would mean that when the trigger was pulled, the revolver cylinder would rotate too far, and in all probability it would fail to fire.
So that, had it happened 6 or 8 shots earlier, Ruth Ellis would not have been able to have shot David Blakely?
This seems likely.
But however efficient the gun, where had Ruth Ellis got it from? At the trial, her story that she'd been given it as security on a debt went unchallenged. Did anyone believe it, even the judge?
She did give some sort of explanation as to how she came into possession of that revolver, but it was never very convincing, and nobody ever really knew how she did get it.
Did you believe her explanation?
I didn't believe her explanation on that, no, I didn't.
You thought she got it elsewhere?
Yes. I suspected somebody had given it to her.
That's the end of the first roll. Okay. Ready?
Right, now what do we got?
As Solicitor John Bickford prepared the defence for the trial of Ruth Ellis, he says he faced a dilemma. What to do with the story he says Desmond Cusson had told him that he had given Ruth Ellis the gun with which she'd killed David Blakely on Easter Sunday 1955.
Assault, criminal damage.
3 counsel were to appear for Ellis: Melford Stevenson, Seabag Shaw and Peter Rawlinson. Bickford decided to tell them nothing about Cusson's story. He reached the decision for 2 reasons. First, if he revealed the story, he believed it could result in Cusson being charged as an accessory, which wouldn't have helped Ellis. Second, Ruth Ellis was adamant. She didn't want Cusson involved. So, in building the defence, Bickford decided to concentrate his efforts, right or wrong, on Ruth Ellis's state of mind when she pulled the trigger. Well, she'd had a miscarriage only 13 days before the shooting. What effect would that have had on her? Psychiatrist William Sargent.
There you are.
The maximum time of mental illness in women is at puberty, childbirth, and change of life. And many women, following having a child or aborting a child, develop depressions.
Would you have thought this was relevant as something to have been introduced into a court case?
I should have thought it would have yes.
But there was one other piece of evidence concerning Ruth Ellis's state of mind that the defence knew nothing about. During 1951, her husband George Ellis underwent treatment here in a mental hospital for his alcoholism. And following the violent and bitter rows between them, Ruth was anxious to get a divorce. But it was the manner in which she set about trying to get the evidence for the divorce that's remarkable. She used to travel quite frequently on this hospital bus to see her husband. She did so for 2 reasons. The first was quite simply to find out how he was getting along. But the second is rather more significant.
There is a sworn statement by a male nurse of 19 years' duration. In other words, he was a very competent man, saying this: "It was common knowledge among the staff of the hospital, including myself, that Mrs. Ellis appeared to be on constant watch and inquiry and continually checking up with the staff, patients, and even visitors on the bus serving in the hospital as to every movement of Mr. Ellis."
It was T.P. Rees, a colleague of Dr. Sargent's, who'd been treating Ellis and knew the case history. What did this behaviour mean then?
Well, it means she was paranoid.
And what does that mean?
It means she was suspicious. And that's exactly what T.P. Rees told me.
At the trial, the jury never heard T.P. Rees's evidence because Ruth Ellis chose not to tell the defence the details of her husband's stay in mental hospital. Her lawyers put another psychiatrist into the witness box to assess her state of mind. Duncan Whittaker had met her for only 2 hours in her cell. His evidence, that she was emotionally immature, made no impact. The trial was to go badly from the start.
Well, in the event, we didn't cross-examine the witnesses for the prosecution, and Ruth Ellis just threw her case away.
Threw in her hand?
practically.
Gave up?
Yes.
Before she'd gone into the witness box?
Yes.
Did you know this?
No.
Did you sense it?
Yes.
How did you try to stop it?
Couldn't. Well, I don't know whether if I'd been a stronger man or a more determined fellow or didn't mind making a spectacle of myself, perhaps.
What do you mean?
Well, sorry. I had explained to counsel absolutely clearly that, in my view, it was essential to save Ruth Ellis to have the witnesses for the prosecution cross-examined in the way in which the case had been prepared. Now, please forgive me, I had a magnificent team, and I'm not blaming any single one of them for anything. They did their best, and God bless them. But I was completely stunned because my leader, whom I met in the hall of the Old Bailey, with the court all sitting waiting for him and the judge, came up to me and said, "I'm not cross-examining the witnesses of the prosecution." We were late, the trial was overdue, and I suppose on reflection, I also had the courage to say, "I'm so sorry, I can't accept that."
Mr. Justice Melford Stevenson recalls a series of conversations with Mr. Bickford, but he does not recall Mr. Bickford disagreeing with any of his decisions. He says, "There was no point in cross-examining more deeply because there was nothing with which to challenge the basic facts of the prosecution case." He says, "I thought I made this quite clear." Mr. Justice Melford Stevenson goes on, "In France, this would have been a crime of passion, but the judge rejected my defense of provocation as new law. That's why there was no wide-ranging cross-examination, because that left me with virtually no defense." I'm wondering how it is possible for someone on trial for their life to believe that something is going to happen.
And it doesn't.
And it doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely horrifying, I think.
I'm wondering how it is possible for a solicitor who is defending that person to believe that this is going to happen and it doesn't.
I don't know which solicitor you're talking about, but if you're talking about me, I just wanted to crawl under the table because I built my whole case up on it.
Yet, had the case been heard even 2 years later, Mr. Melford Stevenson could have argued provocation more forcibly. In 1955, the lawyer had little freedom to introduce background evidence. The unrelenting law of 1861 still operated. Whosoever shall be convicted of murder shall suffer death as a felon. But in 1957, the law was reformed. Now, it took into account diminished responsibility, abnormality of the mind, as this new Homicide Act described it. Provocation could be things done or things said to the person accused of murder, and it was left to the jury to assess the effect that provocation would have had on a reasonable person. But this was all to happen 2 years after Ruth Ellis hanged. So, could Mr. Melford Stevenson have brought out more of the background to the Ruth Ellis case, as John Bickford believes?
I think quite possibly the time would come when the judge would have intervened and said, Mr. Stevenson, is this relevant to the issue as to whether or not this was lawful killing? I don't know. I think I might well have done this had I been a judge.
Would it not have helped when the matter of a reprieve was raised?
Yes, that does happen sometimes. A counsel is quite deliberately cross-examining. Not that he thinks it's going to help very much with the jury, but he wants it out through witnesses on the shorthand note, so that will help him when he goes either to the Court of Appeal or to the Home Secretary.
On the afternoon of only the second day of the trial, Ruth Ellis was sentenced to death. The jury were out only 23 minutes. Ruth Ellis appeared relieved. Her only complaint? She felt the disruptive role of Blakely's friends hadn't been brought out in court.
At the end of the day, I went down to see Ruth Ellis. And I can remember this poor kid, well, poor kid, she was a naughty girl, with two little tears not streaming, but just trickling down her cheeks. And she said, I don't mind hanging, but why should they get away with it?
Ruth Ellis was taken to Holloway Prison. Jackie Dyer went to see her there.
I can close my eye now. I can see her in a death cell there with our goldfish and our food for the goldfish and that door when she crosses that, she doesn't come back. And the woman, she was never alone, you see. She had to stay in the woman there. And I can see her. She had her hair done for the trial. Bleached,
For 3 weeks, Bickford and others fought for Ellis's life, against her wishes. They petitioned Parliament and the Home Secretary. On July the 11th, the application for a reprieve was rejected. John Bickford went to Holloway to tell Ruth Ellis. Now, surely he'd asked to be released from his promise to his client to say nothing about what he says Cusson had told him about giving her the gun.
Well, she sat down and I started trying to say to her, now look, this is not the finish of everything. And then I was intending to get this release.
To use the information Mr. Cusson had given?
Yes, but she instead turned on me in front of this wardress. Said, I've been wondering what your game was. Said, I know now. She said, no wonder you haven't been to see me. You've been taking money from cousins to see that I go down, or words to that effect, and he goes free.
She sacked you?
Oh, dear.
I must, of course, ask you, Mr. Bickford, did Mr. Cusson ever give you money?
Certainly not, my friend.
But having sacked her lawyer, Ellis wished to make her will. She turned to Victor Mishkon's firm, who'd acted in her divorce. Victor Mishkon and his clerk Leon Simmons first went to see John Bickford.
I asked him, when it was known that she wanted to see me, and that he was now presumably out of the picture, whether there was anything he could think of which would give me a lead, even at this stage, to save her life.
What did he say?
He looked at me and said, try and get her to tell you who gave her the gun.
Nothing more?
Nothing more than that.
You went to the prison?
Indeed I did, with Mr. Simmons.
How was she?
Oh, she was quite remarkable. I shall never forget it. She'd got a little bit of the actress about her, and I remember that she was there in a dressing gown, quite a resplendent one over her prison clothes. And when we walked in, she stood up and, like almost a gracious hostess, said how kind it was of us to be there.
Did she think she was going to die the next day?
Oh, indeed she did. I remember her words, but so that I tell you them accurately, I think it'd be better if I look at the note that I made of them not so long afterwards. And I'll read them to you, if I may. I am now completely composed. I know that I'm going to die, and I'm ready to do so. You won't hear anything from me which says that I didn't kill David. I did kill him. And whatever the circumstances, you as a lawyer will appreciate that it's a life for a life. Isn't that just? And I remember saying to her, yes, I understand what you're saying, but please don't limit facts to those which you think affect the alteration of a will. She wanted to know whether I wanted those facts to try and obtain a reprieve. And she said she wasn't really interested in that at all. And I thought I'd got a duty to carry on pressing her to tell me the truth. And the only way I got the truth, as she told me it undoubtedly was when I asked her whether she thought it was right that her son, when he grew up, should merely get her version of what had happened from what he read in the newspapers, whether that was right for her and whether that was right for her family. And that at last got home. And she told me, yes, all right, I will tell you facts and I will tell you the truth, which hasn't yet been completely known by any manner of means.
She then gave you a statement.
She did, and I wrote it down.
Is this a copy of the statement that she gave you?
Yes, it is.
And the statement, in fact, reads, "It's only with the greatest reluctance that I have decided to tell how it was that I got the gun with which I shot Blakely. I didn't do so before because I felt I was needlessly getting someone into possible trouble. I had been drinking Pernod in Desmond Cusson's flat, and Desmond had been drinking too. This was about 8:30 p.m. We had been drinking for some time. I had been telling Desmond about Blakely's treatment of me. I was in a terribly depressed state. All I remember is that Desmond gave me a loaded gun. Desmond was jealous of Blakely, as in fact Blakely was of Desmond. I would say that they hated each other. I was in such a dazed state that I cannot remember what was said. I rushed out as soon as he gave me the gun." Ellis went on to say that she'd asked Desmond Cusson to drive her to Hampstead, and he'd done so. The statement told the story almost precisely as Bickford says Cusson had told it to him a few days after the murder. Can I ask you whether she struck you at that time as a woman who was grasping at the last chance to save her life, the last chance of a reprieve?
I can answer you very directly. I think at that stage, and indeed afterwards, she was not in the slightest degree interested in saving her life.
You realise that people will say, it will be said, that this was simply a murderess looking at her imminent execution and saying, I shall name anybody, I shall do anything in order to avoid the gallows.
Well, people could say that and think it, but it would be completely and absolutely incorrect.
It was now 20 hours until Ruth Ellis was due to hang. Mishcon brought her statement here to the Home Office. His argument for a reprieve would have been strengthened immeasurably had there been any corroboration of Ruth Ellis's story. And of course, there might have been, because Bickford says that Cusson had told him an identical story. Mishcon, of course, didn't know this. Nobody knew this, except Bickford. Could you not have told him more?
No, I don't think so. I'd have very willingly done so. Not in there, I mean, if it's been counsel or somebody, yes, I think so. But a solicitor coming in those circumstances, I hadn't been released, I didn't have a chance to be released from this bond of confidence.
She had sacked you?
Oh, yes. And I thought, well, I've still been told not to involve this fellow, and the only indirect way I could do it was to ask him to ask her that question.
And yet, here was this woman with her life at stake. Should you not have told him more?
Well, in the events which happened, I think it proves that I should have done willy-nilly, but I didn't. Because I was trying to make the best decision I could in those circumstances, in the atmosphere I was in and the feeling at the time, and I've been at it until I was nearly dead. So perhaps my judgment was at fault, I don't know. It was 21 years ago, maybe it was. If it was, I apologise to Ruth Ellis. I'm sorry, I made a mistake.
Well, I remember looking to the little small Judas hole in the door, and she was sat down at a table with two wardresses at each side of her. See, we only look through for a second, you know, we don't look much, you see.
But how can you size her up in just a second?
Well, on a female, we're not really too worried because, as a rule, her build is approximately the same weight as... You know, you have an idea of a build. You've got, well, you know how old she is, so you've got an idea. You see, we have a fixed table of drops, but we only use that as a guide. We have to use our own experience to get it perfect.
She always had this facade, and she kept it. But I'm sure when I left that Tuesday, she broke down afterwards. I mean, I don't know. The people who were there probably could tell you more than I can, but I'm sure she broke down. Because when you're faced with the fact that the next day you're going to hang, I mean, she might have loved him, you see, and she must have felt, well, life is over. I don't want to live without him. You still have to hang, and that's no joke.
I walk in first, and the assistant walks behind you. Now, I take a left arm and put it behind her back and just slip a rope on, you see. And my assistant will lift the other arm up and put it there, and I buckle it up and fasten them both together behind the back, you see. But you've got to be very careful. You haven't to pinch them, you put it on steady. Else if you hurt them, they're going to get upset. You've got to be very gentle with them.
The only time my mother cried was on the day it happened, and she was very upset. But I didn't cry at all. I can remember on that day it happened, that I was waiting for the 9 o'clock news, you know, and that clock to strike. I remember running from room to room, and I happened to go up the second time, and I knelt on the stairs and prayed to God that she would be reprieved. But it didn't work, and the next thing I heard the lady next door knocking on the door telling me it was all over.
Ruth Ellis was buried at first a few yards from where she was hanged, inside the walls of Holloway Prison. But in 1971, the remains of Ruth Ellis were permitted to be reburied, tucked away here in the corner of St Mary's Churchyard, Amersham, under her maiden name, Ruth Hornby. But the tragic story of Ruth Ellis doesn't end here. It has a strange postscript. In 1971, 16 years after the murder, Ruth Ellis's solicitor, John Bickford, went to New Scotland Yard to make a statement. He made it, he said, to set the record straight. He told at last the story he says that Desmond Cusson had blurted out to him that day soon after the murder of David Blakely, so many years before. You told them that Mr. Cusson had told you that he had supplied the gun to Ruth Ellis.
Yes.
You told them further that had the gun not been so supplied, it was perhaps your opinion that the murder might not have been committed.
Yes.
Did you know that John Bickford, who was her solicitor, now says that soon after the shooting, Desmond Cusson told him that he had given Ruth Ellis the gun?
Then why didn't he say it then? Why did he keep it for himself? That would have still delayed something. But nobody is trying to prove that she didn't kill. We all know she killed David Blakely. But everybody comes out with, everybody else, attenuant, I mean, you know, circumstance attenuante in England. Now you recognize the passion, something, crime by passion. Well, if there was a crime by passion, that was a crime by passion, I can assure you.
Whatever else may be said, I've done whatever duty I owed the society, so to speak, in England by completely sort of handing over the information I had, and then nobody could afterwards turn round and say that I had deliberately protected this man for money. I don't want anything to happen to him now, it's too long ago, but I think it was very much a thing where I've been worried about it for years and years.
It's all very good of him saying it now. What fat lot of good that is. Why didn't he say it then? It is no good saying it now. But if he would have said it, I don't say she would have gone scot-free by any means. But he could have still delayed this. She probably wouldn't hang. She might have got 10 years in jail or something like that. But then, you see, you've always got time in front of you. Law change, things. I mean, she might not have done 10 years in jail. But when you kill somebody, you can't go and dig them up and say, well, look, start again, can you? She's dead, gone, done, and finished with. He never said anything.
And this is Ruth Ellis saying, happy Christmas to everyone, and may Jackie make as many tips as possible in the bar of Little Club. May Ruth have a mink coat in the New Year. And may Desmond have all he wishes himself in the New Year.
That's basically the film. At first, Desmond Cusson wished to make no comment. After 22 years, he wanted time to consider. But 2 days later, he agreed to discuss Ellis's death cell statement and Mr. Bickford's revelations. Perth, Western Australia, 10,000 miles from Hampstead, London, is the city in which Desmond Cusson has been trying to build a new life. He came to Australia in 1964, 9 years after Ruth Ellis shot and killed David Blakely one Easter Sunday evening. It was here that we came to ask Mr. Cusson for his observations on the murder and the events leading up to it. Cusson was the third person in the Ruth Ellis case, her alternative lover as he was described in court. For 22 years he's remained silent about his role in the affair. Now, having watched the film, he agreed to discuss it and the allegations contained in it. You've seen the film. Have you got any comment that you'd like to make about it now?
Well, in the light of Mr. Bickford's extraordinary declaration, and then saying he doesn't want to, I think it was hurt me or some words to that effect, I find it very difficult to understand why he made it. Let me state quite clearly, I did not give Ruth the gun, nor on that occasion did I drive her up to Hampstead.
So what was Desmond Cusson doing that weekend? He agreed he'd accompanied Ruth Ellis when she'd smashed in the windows of Blakely's car. He agreed he'd spent the afternoon of the day of the murder with her. But her statement was wrong. They hadn't been drinking heavily in his flat, as she claimed. Yet hadn't her violence at the car warned him, perhaps, of more violence to come?
It hadn't entered my head at the time.
But didn't you drive her there?
Yes.
And you were there and you saw her state of mind?
Well, she was... I don't know how to really say this. She was, well, highly temperamental at times.
I mean, were you simply going along with what this powerful, determined woman was doing?
Well, I was trying to dissuade her from it.
From what?
From carrying on. Well, two of them. I'd always tried to, you know, get them peaceably together, not be continually fighting.
It's almost as if you were under her influence that weekend.
Well, partially, probably. It could have been. I wanted to help her. Not to the point of giving her a gun, if that's what you're trying to get at. That's ludicrous. That's not helping anybody.
I didn't suggest that.
Well, I thought maybe that's what you were trying to get at.
For a time in 1954, Ellis was sleeping with both Blakely and Cusson. Here was a classic situation, two suitors, one woman. According to Cusson, this sexual relationship with him was only brief. But did the men hate each other, as Ruth Ellis claimed in her death cell statement?
I objected to the way that he'd treat her. But I wouldn't say I hated him.
Can I just look at your life early in 1955? You were picking Ruth up every morning to take her to modelling courses. You were paying for those modelling courses. You were helping her to pay the rent on the flat in which she and Blakely were living. You were buying clothes for her. You bought her a pink jacket and a suit. You were paying school fees for her son. You were buying his school clothes. You were feeding her at your flat. And she was sleeping.
Not all the time was I feeding her at my flat.
Sometimes.
Yeah, well, she could come and go as she wished.
And with all this, she was sleeping with Blakely at Edgerton Gardens. It must have been difficult for you.
Well, it was sort of always the question that their association would discontinue.
And
the best of my memory, and I was prepared to put up with it, I think, at the time, and in the hopes that it would.
But it wasn't a situation calculated to bring peace of mind to any one of the three of you.
No, I wouldn't say it was, really.
I mean, how did you feel about it? Were you never angry?
Well, I was obviously angry the time I took him outside and tried to give him a good thrashing.
But that was anger. That was anger at what he had done to her.
Yes.
I'm talking about, were you never angry at what they were doing to you?
No, I wouldn't say I was angry. So I was happy about it. But oh, it seems so ridiculous now. Whether I was just hoping at those days that she'd be good to her word and would give him up. But it always seemed that every time she tried to, one excuse or another, they get back together again.
Would you have married her?
I think I would if she'd made a clean break with him.
And when did you realise you'd lost her?
I suppose, really, when she went and killed him.
So what was Mr. Cusson doing on the evening of the murder?
Probably had a drink. Might have done some office work or something.
You're not sure?
No. Well, there's questions like this after 22 years.
It was a remarkable day, Mr. Cusson.
I know, but one wouldn't remember what one exactly did when one went home.
You don't remember where you were when Ruth Ellis shot David Blakely?
Well, I must have been at home.
You never in all these years said, good heavens, while I was doing so-and-so, she was actually shooting David.
Well, I never thought of it that way.
A few days after the shooting, John Bickford says he went to see Desmond Cusson bearing a message from his client Ruth Ellis. It said that she'd told the police she'd been given the gun in a nightclub, and she wanted Cusson to know this. Does Cusson remember getting the message?
Yes. Yes, something along those lines. I think he mentioned to me.
Why did he bring that message? Why did she want to get that message to you? Because that was all she said to tell you.
Well, I'd have been wondering where she'd got the gun.
But what
her parents were.
Why didn't she send the message to her parents then?
Probably because I was probably closer to her, really, in some ways than her parents.
But why should you be wondering where she got the gun? Wouldn't your chief concern be her well-being? Wouldn't it have been much more likely that she would send a message out to you saying, "Don't worry, Desmond, I'm all right"?
No. That she should send Bickford with that message is strange. Insofar that she had obviously wondered. She would have been thinking. I suppose that I'd want to know where she got it.
After he delivered the message to you, Mr. Bickford says, as you know, that you then told him that you had given Ruth Ellis the gun and driven her to the scene of the crime.
No way. No.
Did you say anything to him?
Well, obviously, I would assume I'd have asked if there was any way in which I could have helped her.
Do you remember asking if there was any way in which you could have helped her?
Not really completely. I think that's obviously the obvious thing that would have entered my head at the time, to see if I could help her in any way at all.
But in what way? I mean, simple things like sending her a box of chocolates, or...?
Oh, no. I think it would have been a little bit more than that.
But what did you have in mind?
Well, possibly if any way I could have helped with this story of the gun. I suppose I was in a state where I could have said anything stupid.
Done anything stupid?
I suppose it's a possibility. I was very upset about the whole matter.
Like what?
When you say like what?
What
sort of stupidity? Well, I don't know, because I don't think, it didn't occur.
But to do with the gun, what sort of stupidity? I mean, you must have something in your mind when you say, I might have said anything stupid about the gun. Such as what?
I don't really know.
Such as, I gave her the gun?
No, I couldn't have said a thing like that.
I must tell you that Mr. Bickford is quite adamant that you did say a thing like that.
Well, I don't know. upset state. Maybe I intimated something like that. It did appear to me at the time to be such a lame excuse for her having a gun.
And of course, at the trial, no one seems to have believed that she'd got the gun as security on a debt. Victor Mishcon confirms that in her death cell statement, Ellis named Desmond Cusson as the man who gave her the gun. But Cusson denies even that he had a revolver in his home. So why did Ruth Ellis say this on the day before she hanged?
Her last statement to Victor Mishcon could only have been a complete desperate effort to get herself a stay of execution or something like that. Whether or not it was intended to try and, how should we say, appeal to the sympathetic side of my nature or something like that, well, we don't know. She's not here to tell us, unfortunately.
But you are here to tell us. And I'm wondering whether or not you took notice of the very clear impression of Mr. Mishcon that she really didn't care about dying, that he had to drag that statement out of her.
Yes, I think there's something to be said for that, that it had to be dragged out of her. The fact that she didn't care about dying, I think that's fairly obvious in her trial.
So how can you argue that she was making a last-minute effort to save herself?
Well, I think everybody's entitled at the last moment to try and save themselves.
Ruth Ellis did not save herself. She was executed at 9 a.m. the day after making the statement. 9 years later, Desmond Cusson emigrated to Australia. He came to this new world with high hopes and £10,000 in his pocket, having sold his share in the family business in London. But somehow, things haven't worked out. Today, he runs a flower shop on the outskirts of Perth, Western Australia. It isn't doing too well. Before this, he tried selling second-hand cars and had his business closed because he didn't have the correct trading licence. He speculated on stocks and shares, unsuccessfully. He prepared feasibility studies for estate agents and lost £3,500. He became involved in an import-export business and failed. Even now, this autumn, his business is fading because, he says, there are worms in his stock of carnations. Little remains of what he brought with him from England, except his memories.
Looking back on it now, well, these are difficult questions to answer because she's gone. Why speak evil of the dead? I've had many misgivings and thoughts run through my mind since then. I, in those days, obviously acted as a bloody fool. But what I did with the best of intentions.
But she's still in your mind.
She always will be. And I was very fond of her. You just don't cut a person out of your mind that you've been fond of in life.
The only woman for you?
I thought so at that time. I did meet somebody else since, who shall be nameless. She unfortunately died of cancer over east. I was beginning to become very fond of her as well. And there was no doubt she was of me.
Life's hard.
Yes. Some find it easy, some find it hard.
It's 22 years now since Ruth Ellis was hanged. Desmond Cusson has never married. For 22 years, he's remained silent about the part he played in the last few months of Ruth Ellis's life. He's allowed others to say their piece and make their accusations. I don't know whether Desmond Cusson gave Ruth Ellis the gun with which she shot and killed David Blakely. Perhaps no one will ever know for certain. But of that tragic triangle, Ellis, Blakely, and Cusson, two of them are now dead, and Desmond Cusson, however far he travels, will live in the shadow of the events of that April day in Hampstead for the rest of his life.